Hi everyone, my name is Frank Palmieri from Vietnam Air War and Combat Aviation and Defence. Today, interview for everyone to enjoy. Today I'm interviewing a great friend that I have, Donnie Fisher. He's all the way from Florida in America and he's a Vietnam veteran. Welcome. How are you, Don?
Thank you, Frank. Thank you.
Okay, Don, tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I was born in 1935. My father was a famous champion jockey on the racetrack, and so was his brother, my Uncle Herb.
Mm-hmm.
So we traveled. My brother, I had an older brother, Reggie, and we traveled with the racetrack. It moved all around with the seasons. We traveled until 1941 when war broke out with Japan and Germany, and the races were canceled for the duration of the war, and we settled in Baltimore, my mother's hometown. And there we went to Catholic schools, and
there you
right
go.
through, yeah.
So
right
that's okay. So when did you start having an interest in aircraft?
Well, it was a flight in a J3 yellow Piper Cub when I was about 10 years old, and that started my interest. My brother and my father were already flying gas engine powered model planes, large model planes, and so I didn't build any planes, but I did get interested in aviation at that time.
Yep. Wow.
So then,
yeah, go on.
Yeah, when we went to high school, my mother's dream had always been that we would both go to the Naval Academy at Annapolis, and my brother joined the Naval Reserve, and he won an appointment to Annapolis.
Okay.
So 2 years later, I had joined the Naval Reserve, and I won an appointment to Annapolis, to the Merchant Marine Academy, to the Coast Guard Academy, and I won a scholarship, a Naval Reserve scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania. And of course, I picked Annapolis and followed my brother to the Naval Academy.
Oh, and what did you do in the Naval Academy?
Well, I studied and ran my butt off for 4 years. I became an expert pistol shot.
Yep.
And I became the chess champion and the chairman of the chess team at Annapolis. And then I graduated and took a commission as a second lieutenant in the Air Force.
Oh, okay. So you joined the Air Force from university?
Yes, because the Air Force did not have their own academy graduating anybody yet.
Okay.
So they let us, from Annapolis and West Point, they let us go, if we wanted to, into the Air Force.
And what year was that?
That was 1957. My brother Reggie had preceded me into the Air Force, and he was already a lieutenant flying fighters in the Air Force when I got commissioned.
Excellent. Okay, so you joined the Air Force through college. Where did you do your basic training?
Well, I did primary first in Bartow, Florida, and then I did my basic training in Laredo, Texas, and got my wings there.
Wow. And what did you fly? So this is the 1950s. What was the primary trainer then?
The primary trainer, the first little one, was the T-34. I think it was Beechcraft T-34. And then the bigger trainer was the T-28 with a great big rotary engine on it. And then for basic training, we flew jets. We flew the T-33 jet down in Laredo.
That's the Shooting Star, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So they were
And then,
two-seaters?
yes, it's a two-seater. And then I selected fighters, and I went on to F-86 gunnery school outside of Phoenix, Arizona.
Oh, tell us about the F-86. What was that like to fly?
Well, it was simply marvelous. To this day, I still love the airplane and have the sweetest memories.
Mm-hmm.
But it was limited. It was one of the Air Force's very first fighters, and it did not have an afterburner.
Mm-hmm.
So it was beautiful to fly. It would turn nicely. It had a lovely gun sight. But it wouldn't light up and go through the Mach like the later airplanes with afterburners would.
Right, and so how long were you flying F-86s?
I flew it for 6 months. I finished first in my class and made Top Gun.
Yep.
There were no fighter assignments for us. I had the first choice of all my classmates. So I chose to go back and instruct in T-33s in Alabama, Selma, Alabama.
Yep.
And I did that for 4 years, instructing young lieutenants and giving check rides.
Excellent, excellent. So, you in the F-86? What happened then? Did you move to 104s then, F-105s, or how did you get to Vietnam?
Well, the main way I got to Vietnam was a war started and they were needing fighter pilots.
Yeah.
I had gone after I finished instructing in 1963. I had gone to graduate school at the University of Oklahoma and got a master's degree in aerospace engineering.
Wow.
And by then, in 65, when I graduated, the war was really getting underway. So I volunteered for combat and fighters. And the Air Force, God love them, sent me to a desk job in Ohio.
Well, that's close.
And so I kept pestering everybody, and I kept volunteering. And finally, a year later, they sent me, and I asked specifically for 105s because I knew they were flying the big mission up north against North Vietnam. So I asked for that airplane and got it a year later. In the end of 1965.
Okay, so you would have got more training in the F-105?
Yes, very similar to what we did in 86. We went for 6 months gunnery school and competition. I again finished first in my class and was Top Gun. And from there, I was assigned to Tak Lee, Thailand, a Royal Thai Air Force base, the 105s there. And I flew 55 missions over North Vietnam and probably about 10 or 12 missions over Laos and South Vietnam, but the only ones we counted were the ones over North Vietnam.
Sure. So tell me about the F-105. Tell me about the plane. I'm very interested to know in a pilot's perspective.
It was simply marvelous. It was so fast.
Yeah.
And
because it's a huge plane in comparison even to an F4. It's quite large. It's even got a bomb bay, doesn't it?
It was the largest single-engine fighter we'd ever made in its day. Yes, and a big tall ladder to climb up to the cockpit, and it weighed a little over 50,000 pounds, fully loaded with bombs and fuel for a combat.
Actually, it didn't have an internal bay. you had, how many hard points did it have on the plane?
I think it had 4 hard points, 2 on each wing,
Yep.
that I recall using, but it did in fact have an internal bomb bay.
It did,
because
didn't it?
it was originally designed as a strategic low-altitude penetration fighter bomber to carry nuclear weapons and to go fast.
Yep.
At the same time, they designed a bomb bay, an internal bomb bay, so you could carry the weapon and yet it would not slow you down.
Ah, right.
Now,
Yep.
we obviously were in a non-nuclear combat situation with North Vietnam. So what they did was they put in a big internal fuel tank in the internal bomb bay, and that gave us extra fuel, and then we carried external fuel tanks as well.
Yeah, because I've seen many pictures of the F-105 with bombs under the belly, like 2 or 6, I don't know, 750 pounders, I think they were.
6 750s was the standard load. We carried them on a multiple ejector rack called a MIR rack right under the center, and then out on the main wing mounts we carried two 450-gallon fuel tanks.
Yep.
And that was our standard load for going up north and bombing military targets over North Vietnam.
And you had the internal cannon. Did they ever carry sidewinders or anything like that?
I did carry sidewinders a few times, and when we accompanied the Wild Weasels on anti-SAM flights, SAM suppression flights, we also carried the Sparrow mission, which would ride down the radar beam of the SAM and go right into the radar truck if they kept their radar turned on. And so we carried sidewinders. I never got to launch them on enemy fighters, but we also carried the Sparrow for the SAM units that might be locking onto it.
So the Sparrows were basically used as an air-to-ground weapon?
Well, yeah, they were. And they used the enemy's radar as a guidance, and they rode in the radar beam as long as the enemy left it on. And they rode it right into the target, and they were remarkably accurate in that regard.
Interesting. So where were you based inside inside the war zone? You were based in Thailand?
Yeah, we were almost all of these flights over North Vietnam were from Thailand.
And what was your squadron?
I was in the 357th Squadron, tactical fighter squadron. It was part of the 355th Wing.
Right.
Based at Tok Lee.
At Tok Lee. Okay, and so when you took off from Tok Lee to get into Vietnam, that wouldn't have been too long, would it?
Well, it wasn't too long, but you never knew exactly what was going to happen when you got into the combat area. It was so heavily defended with all the weapons that the Russians and the Red Chinese had sent them. So what we did was, almost invariably, we took off, flew up into Laos, and rendezvoused with a C-135 tanker, and we topped off our fuel so that we were up near North Vietnam on the Laos side of the border, and we were full of fuel when we left the tanker and headed down for our targets.
Sure. So back on base, how did they allocate the missions, and where did you get your briefings? All on the base?
We had a a secret area behind a big barbed wire fence and a guard there checking everyone's credentials.
Mm-hmm.
And all the briefings were held inside that building for all of our missions.
Okay.
And it was right down on the flight line.
Mm-hmm. And then from there, you would plan your mission, and would that happen on the same day or the next day, or would they have it all prepared for you?
For the most part, we planned our mission the night before. It was assigned to us the night before.
Yep.
And then we went down and got the most up-to-date briefing by intelligence and the weather people.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'd take a break. This was normally around 5 in the morning.
Yep.
We all had trucks that each flight could use. We'd ride up to the O Club and get some breakfast, and then ride down and all get dropped off at our airplane.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because one of the typical stories I hear from the war in Vietnam, that planes used to, how can I say, have timetables, and the enemy used to predict where they used to go. Or did you take off at any old time for your missions?
No, that's a sad, regrettable story, Frank. And but the truth has been published, so I'm not exposing anything that isn't already out there.
No.
The planners for our missions were too rigid and programmed.
Mm-hmm.
And so they tended to send our flights out, the morning flights and then later the afternoon flights, at the same times.
Mm-hmm.
And they pressured us to use the same routes into North Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
All of which made the defenses and the planned interceptions
Mm-hmm.
for the North Vietnamese easier, but then also they could move more of their anti-aircraft weapons and their SAM missiles to the end of those paths so that they'd be ready for us when we came by.
Yeah, it's very illogical. I mean, hindsight is a great thing, but when I read about it, it defies a bit of logic, doesn't it?
Well, let me tell you something that's even more irrational and just downright discouraging. For the big missions going into package 6 Alpha, which included Hanoi and a lot of the most lucrative targets around Hanoi, they were mostly planned by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and sent down to us, and we weren't allowed to change anything about them.
Wow.
The Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they were very rigid and inflexible, and yet we had our Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, notifying the North Vietnamese through the Swiss embassy in Switzerland of the time and the targets for next morning's big missions.
Why?
It's appalling, isn't it?
I've read about that, and I can never believe what I read. I mean, that is accounts for treason.
And I didn't learn about this till many years after Vietnam, but my speculation is just one pilot's speculation. I think Dean Rusk was a very moral and caring human being, and he thought he was going to minimize civilian casualties. If he notified the North Vietnamese, they would move their children, their school children, the sick people in their hospitals and other civilians out of the way of our targets. And thus he would save human lives who were essentially non-combatants.
But he's sacrificing the lives of his fellow officers.
That's exactly right. He put all of us fighter pilots in much greater peril because the North Vietnamese didn't seem to have one humanitarian bone in their mean-spirited bodies, and of course they loaded up weapons in and around the target areas, none of which were schools or hospitals or places where there'd be a concentration of civilians. So our target areas were loaded up with weapons freshly moved in, and some SAMs too, because they were mobile as well.
And not only that, they could put some MiGs there too, just to mix it up a bit.
Oh, they alerted the MiGs and planned them as well. Coordinated MiG attacks on us along with the SAM launches. And they had it all waiting for us. And thanks primarily to Secretary of State Dean Rusk. But I don't doubt that the man's intentions were honorable and humanitarian. But the consequences were everything but that.
Maybe someone should have
incredibly naive.
Maybe someone should have put him on the flight, or maybe his son. That would have been different. Maybe they could have put his son on the flight and see how it might change. A lot of good people died because of his generosity.
Yeah, it probably would have changed in a hurry if he had to go on one of those Joint Chief of Staff missions and had the whole world shooting at him.
So tell me, what was it like to prepare for your mission? What did you have to do, and what was it like flying there to downtown Hanoi?
Well, we had to get up at around 4:30 or thereabouts.
Yep.
And go and get the briefing, then grab a little breakfast, and then go to our airplane. I was eager. I was a volunteer. I'd been volunteering all over the place. And then I got to Thailand, and I volunteered to go on the biggest missions.
Okay.
Now,
what were they?
Well, the first one I volunteered for was the biggest target the Air Force had up north, which was JCS, Joint Chiefs of Staff, number 51. And that was the petroleum, oil, and lubricant storage area just a little northeast of Hanoi.
Okay.
It was a huge area with these great big tanks. And it turned out that before I got there, about 5 months prior, our squadron had hit that thing. And put all kind of fires, lots of holes in the tanks, and essentially shut it down. But now, over 5 months later, they find out it's back in action again, all patched up. So they came down and they gave my squadron a primary role in hitting that target. And I lobbied around with the boss, the squadron commander, and his deputy commander to get on that mission, and they put me on it. I was number 4 with my squadron commander leading, and we came down off this ridge line. We called it the Hogback. It was later renamed Thud Ridge. But we came in. It was about a 5,000 foot high ridge line that ran about 25, 30 miles. And if you got up there in North Vietnam, went beyond Hanoi to the north, and then dove down, we could hide on the edge of the ridge line and be sheltered from the radars. They could not track us. Therefore, they could not launch their SAMs until we came off the southeast end of Thud Ridge. And then we're in the valley, and the game is on. They can launch SAMs, they can send fighters, and they had thousands of anti-aircraft guns. 37 millimeter, 57 millimeter, and they also had 85 millimeter, and then they added 100 millimeter. So they had an awful lot of weapons from Russia and China. And they even had, I learned later, Chinese crews manning the anti-aircraft guns in North Vietnam. We didn't know that at the time, but we did find out later. So anyway, to take out this big target of petroleum storage, JCS-51, we came off of Thud Ridge and headed straight for it. And we're just a few miles north of their biggest fighter base, Phu Quyen. It's in like the south part of Hanoi.
Sure.
And here came the MiGs after us, and I was number 4. Now, there are always these little things which end up to being actually big things. Since I was number 4, and the base and Air Force headquarters, 7th Air Force in Saigon, they wanted pictures. This was a big target, big deal back in Washington. They wanted pictures of all the bomb strikes and the destruction. So they stuck a gigantic camera on my right outboard station. My pylon had this, it was a semi-spherical, and it had lens in the front at an angle and lens out the back. So while I was diving in on the target, it would be taking pictures of the guys ahead of me and their hits. And then as I pulled up, it would record my hits and the total destruction to the target area. Now, that's all good, except I had drag that the other 3 airplanes did not have, and I couldn't keep up with them.
Wow.
So as we fly past Phu Quyen, here come 4 MiG fighters, and they also took off with full fuel tanks, and they wanted to get us, and they could barely keep up with us, even when we had bombs and fuel tanks hanging, because we were very fast. So they wanted to be as fast as they could be. So as they turned into me at my 3 o'clock position, they all punched off their fuel tanks together. And they were so close, I could see the fuel splash out where the tank separated from the wing. That's how close they were. And I'm lagging way behind with this damn camera. So all 4 of them dropped onto my tail. Now, normally, our standard bombing practice was to go in at 5,000 or 6,000 feet. That meant that if the SAMs launched on us, we weren't far from ground, and the ground clutter that would mess up their radar picture. And so if we got launched on by SAMs, we'd dive for the ground to break radar lock. If we didn't, we'd stay there until it was time to pop, which meant lighting the afterburner and climbing up with afterburner to about 12,000 so we could do our dive bomb pass. All of the bombing was to be done by dive bombing. It's accurate and it's harder for them to hit you, etc. And so
what altitude? What altitude were the SAMs shot when they were firing the SAMs? What altitude were you at to be?
Say that again.
I said for them to fire their SAMs, what altitude did you have to be?
Well, the higher we got, the more vulnerable we were to them maintaining a lock-on. As long as they had a lock-on, they could drive the SAM right up that beam to our airplane.
Sure.
But somewhere down about 1,000 feet to 400 feet or so above the ground, somewhere in there, they would get radar clutter that would cover us up.
Yep.
They'd lose their lock on, and then if they launched their SAMs, it wouldn't follow us because their radar beam was not following us anymore.
I understand. However,
So
on that altitude, you would have had a lot of AAA.
And that's what shot down most of our airplanes throughout the war, Frank. That's the perfect deduction, and it's 100% true. We lost most to the AAA because the SAMs took the higher altitudes away from us. Had to fly down low, which meant we were in the range of the 37 millimeter, 57 millimeter, and 85 millimeter cannons. And some of those were radar guided as well. So anyway, on this particular Joint Chief of Staff mission, I knew I lost sight of them. They all dropped right behind me onto my tail. And I didn't see any tracers coming by yet, but I knew they had to be there and probably within gun range.
Yep.
Because the 17 did not carry any missiles. But I knew they were there. And I knew if I attempted to light the afterburner and pop up to 12,000, they were much lighter. They had afterburners, and they would close on me and kill me for sure. So I made a split-second decision while my squadron commander and the two other guys all lit their burners and popped. I lit my burners and went all the way down to 900 feet.
Wow.
And as I flew in to the petroleum storage area, their bombs were already dropping and starting to go off. And I just flew right into the black smoke at 900 feet, and I just flew straight and level, and I dropped my bombs right in the middle. I mean, I couldn't miss.
No.
So I dropped all 6 of my 750s right in the middle of that mess. And I caught up with my guys getting out of there. And I don't, a million guns were shooting at us. So I don't know how they missed me, but here I am. So they obviously missed me. And we went home.
Yep.
Now, I may sound petty with this next part of the story. There's always that rest of the story thing.
Yep.
Over 5 months prior, our squadron had gone on that mission, nailed the tanks, started fires and put holes in them, and they all got a silver star, all 4 of them,
Yep.
because it was such a dangerous mission. So we got the target. It was burning from one end to the other, and they got the pictures, and they were satisfied. So then they wrote us all up for a Silver Star. The Silver Star went from our base in Thailand to 7th Air Force headquarters in Saigon, and it was approved. Now it was sent on to Pacific Air Force headquarters in Hawaii for final approval. It got to Hawaii, and some guy behind a desk who probably never got shot at decided they were handing out too many Silver Stars, so he downgraded it to a Distinguished Flying Cross, which is a nice award. I already had one. But anyway, he downgraded it, but he changed the reason for the award on them, and it said, instead of for outstanding flying in a combat zone or something, it said for heroism. So he gave us heroism, but took away the Silver Star. And that was the end of that.
Oh, well, you know what? You did a great job. You made it home, more importantly. And, more importantly, is you're back with your family. I mean,
boy. You got that right.
Boffins run everything, don't they?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, they do.
what other missions? What other types of missions did you go on? So you had, like you said, you had a wild weasel. You accompanied the wild weasels.
We did. Yes.
Haiphong, did you? You must have gone into Haiphong a few times.
No, we did not, because again, you know, you have such bureaucracy in government, and that includes the military.
Mm-hmm.
They had split the biggest targets in the north of North Vietnam.
Yep.
They split them with a diagonal line, and on the coastline to the east, that was all Navy.
Oh yes.
And to the west and northwest, including Haiphong, that was all Air Force, and you don't dare cross the line. So we never went near Haiphong, and the Navy fighters never came near Hanoi.
Oh, right.
Isn't that bizarre? Yeah.
Well, one famous one did. He ended up in the soup, didn't he? McCain.
Oh, John McCain ended up, yeah. And he was over close to Hanoi, so I don't, maybe that was early in the war before they drew the lines.
Yep.
I don't know, but yeah, he landed in a little lake.
Yep.
Right, I think in the south of Hanoi, and boy,
he landed right in the middle of Hanoi.
Yeah.
When I went to when I stayed there last time, I stayed right on that lake. It was very ironic.
Yeah.
So you flew 105s. Did you fly anything else during the war?
No, I flew 105s. I had grown. Oh, incidentally, those MiGs that came out and intercepted us and dropped behind me.
Yep.
They came from Phuc Yen and Kep and the other airfields.
Yep.
At the time I was there in 1966, they were all off limits.
This is during Rolling Thunder, isn't it?
Yes, it was Rolling Thunder, and they were all off limits. We could not touch any of them. Furthermore, and even more strategically demoralizing, Haiphong Harbor was off limits, and the Navy was not allowed to mine it.
Incredible.
And so that's where almost all the Russians' weapons came in, including everything, you know.
So everything came in through Haiphong. They set it all up. They drove it out to whatever the next target was, ready for you guys to come in the next day.
That's right. And the rest of it came down from China on the Northeast Railroad, which we hit. We hit a number of times.
Yep.
And some came from the Northwest Railroad, which we also hit some of the time.
Wow. So with friends like that, who needed enemies, eh?
Yeah, and so yeah, it was terribly.
It was pretty. It was. So when did you? So you've done all your missions, and then you were sent back to the States after you. Did you have to set? Did you have to accomplish a certain amount of missions?
Yes, that was, and you showed me earlier. You had shown me the patch, the 100 mission patch. Yeah, and I never got there. I got to 55 missions over North Vietnam and about 12 or 14 over Laos and South Vietnam. And meanwhile, I was getting more and more angry and disgusted because we weren't allowed to touch these targets, which would have ended the war much quicker.
Yep. Yep.
especially Haifa Harbor, but also the fighter bases because they were coming after us all the time. And so here I was getting angry and more disgusted, and I found I was getting weaker.
Yep.
I'd been running on my days off with the second lieutenants, and I couldn't run. And then I started having trouble pulling the stick back. The pressures on the F-105 stick in an elevator, forward and back, were heavier than other airplanes. They weren't unreasonable, but they were heavier. But now I was getting so weak, I was having a terrible time pulling the stick back.
Yeah. Well, is that physically and mentally?
Physically and mentally, yeah.
Yeah, the effects of all that, like I say, all that stress it was getting upon you. That's understandable.
Yeah, and so I flew that mission that I told you about earlier,
Yep.
that we covered up north, and I was flying with this bird colonel. He was the #2 deputy commander of the whole base. He'd just gotten there. He had 5 missions, but he wanted to do everything his way, and he didn't know what he was doing.
Yeah.
And so we had 2 MiGs pop up in the middle of our flight because he had lagged so far behind.
Mm-hmm.
I had called him. He's a colonel, I'm a captain, but there's a limit. I had called him and told him to close up the formation earlier, and he didn't. So we had this big separation between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and then all of a sudden these MiGs popped up in front of us. Obviously the MiGs and their radar controller on the ground did not know we were there, and we were in a beautiful position to shoot them both down. But this colonel suddenly broke out of the formation and went for what he thought was the target all alone, leaving me with 2 MiGs right in front of me, but spread out left and right.
Yep.
And they're on the tail of my squadron commander and this young lieutenant that I used to run with, that I was very good friends with.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm supposed to go with #3 because I'm his wingman, but he's just abandoned us all, and I had split seconds to decide.
And you're still loaded with bombs
hell-
at this stage?
Yes, we still had bombs at this time.
Okay.
Which is, it's an interesting part of the story because I've never heard of anyone else that's ever done this. In a split second, I couldn't figure out what the colonel was doing, but I decided to hell with him. One of the MiGs is right on the tail of my squadron commander and my friend whom I run with.
Yep.
I'm going to go after that MiG, but it meant the other MiG would be free to drop right on my tail.
Yep.
So this colonel broke into me, heading for what he thought was the target, and it was virtually a midair about to happen. He never even looked at me or saw me. I was out almost lying abreast on his left wing.
Mm-hmm.
He broke right into me hard, and so I pulled up and did a soft aileron roll or a little barrel roll over him.
Yep.
And I knew, it's amazing how fast your brain can work when it has to. I knew as I came out of that roll, I would have to go after the MiGs myself,
Mm-hmm.
and I had to get my bombs and my fuel tanks off to have my airplane fast and maneuverable for dogfighting.
Yep.
So as I rolled up and over him inverted, we were canopy to canopy, I hit the salvo button and I blew off my bombs and my 450-gallon fuel tank.
Well, when you were inverted?
Inverted.
So you dropped your tanks when inverted?
I punched them. Now they have a little charge that blows them clear, but I think it only blows them a few feet. But anyway, yeah, I was inverted. I've never heard of that before or since. And it turned out later on, I came back and landed.
Yeah.
We had a little white jammer pod that you couldn't punch off that was bolted in to the outer pylon on the right wing. And it turned out one of the little radio antennas only sticks down about 5 inches, had been smashed.
Mm-hmm.
And it was either one of my fuel tanks or one of the bombs had hit it. And that's how close that stuff came to my wing as I rolled and jettisoned everything on the airplane.
While inverted.
So while inverted. So it was a very close call, but I came out the bottom,
Mm-hmm.
wings level, the colonel was gone, and now I got 2 MiGs to pick from because I don't have the colonel to take the other one. And so I had to, I knew my conscience. I knew I had to pick the one that was right on the tail of my my Lieutenant Colonel Bob Wayne, who was leading the attack, and his wingman.
And the only thing you had was what? Just the gun?
I had the gun, but hey, it's better than nothing. And it was a wonderful gun. So anyway, I moved on them, and I flew right past this other MiG. And as I flew past him, I was fairly close, like 300 or 400 feet, but I was too wide to shoot at him, or I would have shot at him on the way, but it was too much of a turn. I couldn't have gotten directly to the MiG that was on the tail of my buddies. So as I came by him, I looked at him, and he was wearing a white helmet, and his helmet just turned and looked at me. They never knew we were back there behind him.
Mm-hmm.
He was, I'm sure, amazed, and I knew in about 1 minute he's going to be right on my tail, hosing me off with his guns. But I couldn't help that. I had to get the other MiG.
Yep.
So I pressed on in burner, really starting to speed up, and then I got greedy. I came out of burner, slowed it down a little bit to give me more tracking time when I fired at the lead MiG. And right about then, apparently, his wingman called him and told him to brake. And everybody was in a left turn as my guys were going up to pop to hit the target. And this MiG was in the left turn tracking them. And suddenly he did the tightest right turn I have ever seen a jet airplane do in my life.
Wow.
That MiG could turn on a dime, and he did.
Yep.
So he was gone. I knew that 1 and 2 were safe.
Yep.
And I looked back, and here's this MiG right on my, he was like my 730 position, turning in on me.
Yep. Yep.
And I thought, okay, I'll break into him and make him overshoot at least once, and then maybe I get my nose down, but I already put the burner back on.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I can open up some distance on him because I knew I couldn't outturn him. I didn't have a hope of doing that.
Yep.
And as I broke into him, he just bent his airplane around, and there was no overshoot at all. He was in tracking position, pulling lead. I could see the bottom of his wing, and I knew I was a dead man. And he was probably at this time only about 600 or 700 feet behind me.
Yep. Yep. He was on your six, eh?
It's strange how your brain works in critical situations. He started firing, and immediately I remembered what my instructor told me in F-86 school. My instructor had flown wing for Joe McConnell. Now, you may not know about Joe. Joe McConnell had a movie made about him, starring Alan Ladd and June Allison. Joe McConnell, to this day, is our leading all-time ace.
Okay. Joe
In the
McConnell,
Korean
is he
War.
an ace in jets?
And F-86 is in the Korean War.
Okay. Yep.
He shot down 17. Some of the records say 16, but anyway, he's our leading ace. And I remember my instructor was a wonderful guy named Paul Coleman. Paul said, when the MiGs got behind us and started shooting, their 23 millimeter machine guns on the top of the nose blinked orange real rapidly.
Yep.
They're 37 millimeter cannons.
Yeah, underneath.
Underneath the intake, it belched a big orange belch, but much more slowly because it didn't have the same rate of fire. And I looked at this MiG, and it's doing the same thing Paul had told me about 8 years ago.
Yep.
And it came back to mind immediately. And my brain said, all the normal things that you do in a dogfight, especially if you're out in front and the other guy's about to nail you, there's a number of things you do that we're all taught. My brain just said, you can't do any of the normal stuff. It won't work with this guy. So I took the stick and shoved it straight forward, so it looked like I was still in the left turn and he was out turning me and shooting, except my airplane was now going to the right with kind of a turning inverted flight.
Yep.
And I was going the other way. I came up with a seat, negative G's.
Yep.
It didn't matter. It was something that I'd never heard of. I just invented it on the spot, and I thought it'll give me a few seconds where he'll be way off the target.
Yep.
And then I've got to turn this airplane loose and do one crazy maneuver after another, nonstop, till I get back down there right on the trees.
Yep.
And that's what I did. I threw that F-105 all over the sky, nonstop.
Yep.
I knew he was still back there. I saw the nose blinking. I knew he was still shooting. And finally, there I am down on the trees, right at the southeast end of Thud Ridge.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so I got some trees, bushes, and little hills. So I started bending my bird around these little hills as tight as I could, so that he'd have to come around the hill before he could shoot again. And I noticed he was getting smaller and smaller because I'm clean and I'm in afterburner.
Yep.
And I've got a much faster airplane once I clean it off. He's getting smaller and smaller. Then I noticed he wasn't shooting anymore. I looked one last time, and he was gone. He was gone. So I go climbing up the hogback on the northeast side of the hogback, heading northwest.
Yep.
Now, when you get to the north end of it, you normally turn southwest and head for Laos. And as I'm climbing up the hogback, Thud Ridge, I see a 105 up ahead. So I was going really fast, getting away from the MiG. I pull up to him rather quickly. It's the goddamn colonel.
Wow.
And he can't talk. He went to the target. He got shot up. Turned out he had no radio, but he had no hydraulics either.
Yep.
So right about then, we get to the north end of Thud Ridge. Time to turn southwest and head for Laos. He keeps right on going. Now he's heading northwest. He's heading right into China.
Couldn't he
So
turn?
I stayed with him. I stayed with him for about 30, 40 seconds. Yeah, the hogback's behind us. And I thought, what the hell's wrong with this guy? So I waggle my wings, point at my helmet, and I'm lead, follow me. And I turn left, southwest. I look back. He keeps right on heading northwest. So I turned around, headed back, joined up with him again. Got more violent in my hand signals to follow me, and I turned southwest again. Still, he kept right on going northwest into Red China. So I went back a third time, and I remember talking to myself at this point, and I said, this is it. You don't follow me this time, you can go to hell in China for all I care.
Yep.
And I turned back the third time, waggled my wings, tapped my helmet, and then turned away aggressively so he'd follow me. And he kept right on going. And I thought, up yours, Colonel. And I kept watching him over my shoulder, but I kept right on going.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, when he got to be a tiny speck, he must have finally figured out, hey, I really don't know what I'm doing, and I'm going in the wrong direction. Turned out he'd also lost his gyros, so his gyro compass was lying to him. So, turns him from tiny speck, and I see it, and I thought, yeah, he's turning. He came and joined up on me.
Mm-hmm.
And we got down, the squadron commander and my friend, his wingman, they joined up on us. We all met a tanker, and this colonel, who was all shut up, he could not open his door and get the fuel from the tanker. So my squadron commander took him into Udorn, and me and the lieutenant flew back to Tockley. And
Wow.
my boss invited me in the next day, so I marched into his office and saluted, and he said, Captain Fisher, this guy was a really cool guy and a great fighter pilot from West Point named Bob Wayne, Lieutenant Colonel Bob Wayne.
Yep.
I says, yes, sir. He says, you know, you saved the colonel's life yesterday. He didn't know about the MiGs at all.
Yep.
Knew about the colonel.
Well,
And,
wow, that's a great story.
And so then I get called, and the colonel wants to see me in his big office.
Yep.
So I go and see this bird colonel, and I report to him, and he says, you know, Fisher, I just wanted to thank you for yesterday. That was really great. And I was so furious and so frustrated. Of course, I was also feeling terrible. I said, Colonel, did you not see those two MiGs right in front of us? He said, oh, yeah, I saw them. But then I spotted the target, so I went for it. I thought, oh, my God. I saluted and left.
Yep.
And I notified the flight shack that I was all finished. I was never going to fly another mission.
Yep. You were done.
So, the story goes on, though.
Yeah?
Like so many stories do, you know. There's always an epilogue. So, they tried to talk to me, and I was disgusted. Plus, I also was feeling really terrible. And so they said, all right, we're going to fly you over to Clarkfield in the Philippines, and you're going to have to talk to a shrink.
Yep.
I said, okay. So I got on some airplane. I think it was a 135 tanker that was going to go to Clark. And I landed at Clark. They checked me into the hospital. In the evening, they drew blood and urine and all that stuff, and they put me to bed. I was exhausted. I was weak. I wake up at 6:30 in the morning, and here's about 3 doctors and 3 nurses all standing around my bed with charts and talking about me.
Yep.
And I wake up and I said, what's wrong? What's going on? And they looked at me, and one of them said, you have pneumonia. We're transferring you to a pneumonia ward.
Well, there you go.
So I went to a pneumonia ward. It took the better part of a week or whatever, and they cleared up the pneumonia. And then they said, we're sending you back to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas for a group of sessions with a psychiatrist.
Yep.
I just said, okay, I didn't care at that point. So I get back to Texas. I met with the shrinks for about, 3.5 months. They were nice guys. Seemed like no therapy. I just talked to them about what had gone on over there and how angry I was.
Yep.
And they listened sympathetically. And then one day I got a call from the administrative office at Lackland. They said, Captain Fisher, you're returned to full duty.
Okay.
And you have to put in a request for what assignments you want. You have to put in like 3 requests in order of priority you would like to have them. So I go over there and get the forms, and I was really feeling bad. By then, I was feeling good again. You know, I didn't have any pneumonia. I wasn't weak.
Yep.
I was out hitting golf balls every day. And I was feeling bad about not finishing my tour, even though I had this opinion that this war was disgraceful and they were running it in an unconscionable manner. I thought, I don't like not finishing my assignment. So I called my wife and said, honey, I've put you through a lot already, so I can't do this unless you agree. But I want to sign up to go back to combat and finish my tour, and then I want to get the hell out, because that war is pathetic. It's disgraceful the way they run it, and I don't want anything more to do with the Air Force or the military, but I do want to finish up my record.
Sure.
And she said, she's an outspoken nurse, and she says, okay, you go ahead and finish your combat tour, but then I want an end to all this nonsense, and I want you to get a regular job like normal people. I've never forgotten. It was hilarious. And she was mad, and at the end of her patience, but she was willing to let me go back to combat till I finished my tour. So I put in the request, and I got a call from the same man, Major. His name will come to me in a minute when I don't need it. Anyway, the same guy that I met with when I firstly flown into Randolph Air Force Base and requested my 105 assignment in the first place. And he remembered me. He says, he calls me up. I'm in the BOQ, and he calls me. He says, Fisher, what the hell's going on? What happened over there? I said, well, it's a long story. He says, I got your request to go back to combat. I said, yeah, that's right. He says, what the hell am I supposed to do with this? I said, give me another combat assignment.
Yep.
And I could hear him talking to himself, mumbling, you know. Finally, he says, all right, Fisher, I'm putting you in for another combat assignment. I said, thank you. And so everything's fine for about 5 or 7 days. He calls me back again. Foster. Dudley Foster. Major Dudley Foster was his name. Calls me back and says, Fisher, I got your combat assignment right on my desk, but I got bad news for you. He says, it's been overridden by your former base commander, Colonel Bob Scott.
Yeah.
He says, and Colonel Bob Scott has pulled some strings in the Pentagon and gotten your assignment overridden. You're going back to his base to be court-martialed.
What for?
Yeah. I said, really? He said, yeah, Fisher, really. And he says, I'm sorry. I got you your assignment. He says, but this guy's obviously got friends in high places, and he's angry as hell. He wants to make an example of you, so he's going to court-martial. I said, okay, thanks. So the story continues just a little further. And I said, all right, thank you, Major Foster. Hung up the phone. I called my wife, whose mother was a well-known Spanish teacher on public television in Florida.
Yep.
And she was good friends with a very senior Florida congressman in the Congress.
Yep.
And my mother knows and is good friends with a congressman in Baltimore who appointed my brother to Annapolis.
Yep.
So I called my mother after I called my wife. They contacted these two congressmen. They contacted the Pentagon. I put in my resignation, and I was out of the Air Force in a week.
Sure. Well, there you go.
And then I went and became a test pilot.
Excellent. Well, that might, but that might be for our next interview.
Yeah, I'm sorry I went on so long.
No, that's great stuff, mate. Thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome.
That's a great story. I'm sure a lot of people are going to enjoy hearing that.
Well, I hope they do. I know a lot of guys were really mad and disappointed in me when I quit.
Yeah.
But I hope some of them will learn that I tried to come back and finish my tour of duty, and I got shot down. But I did try.
Well, you know what? You quit when you're ahead. It's a probably better thing. You're here in front of us now, and you live to tell the tale.
That may be the only reason I'm here, too.
I think so.
But so many great guys are not here, and it just makes me so sad to think about that.
It does. Absolutely. But, you know, you've done your mission. You did your job, and your career kept going. But that'll be for another interview, I think.
Fair enough, Frank.
Thanks so much, Don.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for your service.
Dubious as it may have been.
Oh, mate, that's a great story. Okay, mate.
All right.
I'll see you soon. Thanks so much.